to Dr. Windler.
Okay, I'm excited to be here. Just as a brief introduction for myself, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm a man in his 30s with short brown hair, glasses, and a blue polo shirt. So that's sort of the basic introduction, but I also wanted to introduce sort of why I am talking about this this topic. And so let's get my screen shared so we can see my slides. Okay. So I want to take you guys back in time to Minnesota in the 90s when I was a little Daniel and I was growing up. And, you know, as a little Daniel, I had some good things going on in my life. I had a nice Stranger Things vibe to my, you know, to my wardrobe, and had a lot of fun being in Minnesota. But I also had a challenge, and my challenge is that I was awkward. And I don't just mean a little bit awkward, I mean very awkward. And I don't just mean very awkward, I mean industrial strength awkward. I, you know, had a very hard time fitting in and connecting with other people. And what I would later learn is that I am on the autism spectrum. I got a diagnosis of Asperger's back when that was a thing that you could get. And my social struggles were because my brain was not wired to learn how to interact in the way that other people's brains were. And, you know, I just sort of had to do my best to try to adapt and figure out how to interact in a way that other people could accept. And, you know, over a lot of years, a lot of effort, I was able to be successful at that. I was able to build, you know, a great community of people who accept me, even though I'm still pretty awkward sometimes. And I was able to start a career as a psychologist, an author, and a speaker to help sort of, you know, share what I've learned and to help other people kind of on that same journey of finding inclusivity and connection. And so this is not just something that is an area of professional interest to me as a psychologist, but it's an area of you know, personal experience that's really important to me. And so I'm really honored and excited that I get the opportunity to talk about all this with you guys today. So let's jump in. Our basic format for today, we're going to sort of group things into three, you know, big buckets. First is that I want to introduce this idea of neurodiversity, help us understand that, you know, because that's what the talk is all about. I'm also going to talk about like the medical model and sort of how the mental health field has traditionally understood issues of neurodiversity and how we could maybe respond to them in a different way. And then I'm going to conclude with some practical strategies for creating a neuro-inclusive world, meaning a world where, you know, neurodiversity is celebrated, accepted, and neurodivergent people have the supports that they need to thrive. We'll also, as was mentioned, we'll end with a Q&A portion. So if you got questions, feel free to fire them off in the chat, and I will not read them at this time. But then at the end of the talk, then we will go through all the questions, and I'm happy to answer as many as I can. So let's jump in. So before we start defining neurodiversity, I want to offer a couple of definitions so that when I use words like neurodivergent, you know what I'm talking about. So neurodivergent, it just means somebody whose brain performs differently than what society considers the norm. So for myself as an autistic person, I'm neurodivergent. Somebody who has ADHD is neurodivergent. This is you know, a little bit of a gray area in terms of, well, if somebody has depression or something, are they neurodivergent? Oftentimes, this is used more to refer to things that are have more of a neurological basis and something that are permanent parts of somebody's experience. Obviously, it's messy because we know that something like depression, there is a biological basis for somebody being more vulnerable to depression. Somebody might struggle with depression all of their lives, but just in terms of how it is typically used, it's typically used more for conditions that reflect more a different way of thinking and experiencing the world, more so than something like depression, although it's still a little bit in flux what exactly is lumped under the neurodivergent bucket. Also neurotypical, that just means somebody whose brain functions in the way expected by society. Neurodiverse is a group that has neurodivergent and neurotypical people. So we wouldn't say that I am neurodiverse because I'm just one person. But if you put me in a room with somebody who's neurotypical, then the two of us would be a neurodiverse group. Finally, there's the idea of the neurodiversity movement, which is a grassroots movement advocating for improvements in how neurodivergent people are viewed and treated in society. And so a lot of the concepts that I'm teaching today sort of came from thinkers and leaders in the neurodiversity movement. So neurodiversity, it can mean different things, but, if you hear about the neurodiversity movement, that's what it refers to. I also want to talk about how to use these terms in a way that is inclusive. And so first of all, it's very important to use neurodivergent rather than abnormal, because, abnormal obviously, connotates some sort of like judgment or negativity to it, whereas neurodivergent, it just means that it's different. It just means that it's not typical, but it doesn't have a value associated with it. In the same way, we want to use neurotypical rather than normal for the same reason. Like if I say, oh, my friend John likes collecting stamps, but I have normal hobbies, that sort of suggests that I think that there's something wrong with collecting stamps. And so normal is a word that we want to avoid if we want to avoid, casting judgment. It's also valuable to use neurotype rather than disorder. So again, instead of saying like, oh, I have the disorder of autism, to say you have the neurotype of autism, because again, it's a neutral word rather than a word that implies that there's something wrong with that. And then finally, with autism specifically, typically autistic people prefer to be referred to as autistic people rather than people with autism. And that's different than sort of the person-first language that's sometimes used with other groups. And not every autistic person prefers this kind of framing, but typically within the autistic community, people do prefer to have autistic first. That's known as identity first language, and it sort of communicates that there's nothing wrong with being autistic, there's nothing to be ashamed of about being autistic, and so there's no reason why I should put that at the end of my identity. I can put that right there at the beginning as I identify myself. And so these are little changes to your language that can help you kind of communicate that you understand these things and you're a safe and inclusive person. Although when in doubt, just ask, because people do prefer to be referred to in different ways. I know some people that still prefer to refer to themselves as, Aspies for Asperger's syndrome, even though that's no longer in the DSM. But when in doubt, these things will kind of guide you pretty well. Okay, so let's get into this idea of neurodiversity. And in order to talk about neurodiversity, we have to talk about polar bears. There's this saying about bears that if it's black, fight back, because a black bear, if you fight back, you might be able to scare it away. If it's brown, lie down, because a grizzly bear might leave you alone if you just play dead. But if it's white, good night, because if you are out on the tundra and you see a polar bear and it's heading your way, too bad. It's going to have you for lunch. There's nothing you can do. Like, the polar bear is an apex predator. It's extremely powerful, extremely dangerous, unless you took that polar bear and you flew it to where I am in Austin, Texas, where it's been like 100 degrees for a month. And then you had it just wander around on the streets. That polar bear would start to have a really hard time. Its white fur that really helped it in the tundra would make it stand out. When it's walking down the street, it's fat and it's padding that keeps it warm, in the cold, would make it have a heat stroke within 3 minutes of getting here. That bear would have an extremely hard time. And so what would our response to that be? Would we say, oh, well, there's something wrong with the bear? It's a bad bear. We should diagnose it with polar bear disorder and, pathologize it, sorry, that word is not coming out of me. I'm just going to keep moving on. Should we judge the bear for that? No, like, we would say this bear is a good bear. It's just that the environment is not set up in a way to meet the polar bear's needs. And so we would want to, change the environment or help the polar bear adapt to its new environment so it could be successful. Neurodiversity essentially communicates that same idea, that our society is naturally set up to accommodate the needs of neurotypical people in society. But it's not set up to accommodate the needs of neurodivergent people. And so, in the same way that a black bear is perfectly suited to the environment, in Texas, a polar bear is not. And so we need to adapt the environment, to meet the needs of neurodivergent people. And the core sort of summary of this idea is Dr. Temple Grandin, probably one of the most famous autistic women in the world, or autistic people, period. She said, "I am different, not less." And that's sort of the core of this idea that somebody who is, autistic, somebody who has ADHD, that's not a deficit, that's not a problem, that's simply a different way of being. And if we are able to change how their environment and how society is set up, then that person might be fully able to thrive. And so there's a couple of core ideas that sort of underlie this viewpoint. The first one is that neurodiversity is a natural part of human diversity. Just as people have different kinds of hair color and different kinds of height, people have different kinds of brains, and that's okay. Also, typical is not better. Just because somebody's brain works in the way that society expects doesn't mean that that's a better brain than somebody whose brain works in a different way. Again, diversity is just a natural part of humanity, and diversity is a strength. It's not that we shouldn't want everybody to be the same. Also, our environment affects our abilities. And I'll explain this a little bit more in the next slide, but a disability might simply be a person in an environment that isn't set up to accommodate them, rather than being an innate problem of that person. And then finally, and this is sort of the core application of neurodiversity, we can design environments that allow everybody to flourish. So instead of just making environments that meet typical needs, we can be thoughtful to design environments that meet all needs. And this really is built on this concept called the social model of disability that was originally developed by the disability rights movement and was most prominently coined by the disabled advocate Mike Oliver. So the core idea, disability is not caused by a condition, it is caused when society fails to accommodate the needs of that condition. And then society automatically meets typical needs, but people with less typical needs get left out. So an example of this, is that if you are a deaf person and you go to the movie theater, you're fully able to enjoy the movie and understand what's going on if the movie theater provides subtitles. But if it doesn't, then you can't enjoy the movie. And so your ability or disability to enjoy the movie, it's not based on your hearing, it's based on the environment. And the movie theater, it provides speakers so that people that with hearing can perceive the movie, and so it could just as easily provide ways that other people could perceive the movie and enjoy it in the same way. If we transfer that over to the idea of neurodiversity, an autistic person is fully able to understand a conversation if the speaker uses explicit verbal communication. If you try to talk with me and you rely on implication and body language and subtext, maybe I'm going to miss that. But if you just sort of straight out tell me something, I can understand that just as much as any neurotypical person could. And then we can also expand this kind of to everybody. Like if you're like, oh, I could never dance, I have 2 left feet. Well, if the DJ plays the Macarena, you can dance just fine. You just needed an environment that was set up to allow you to be successful. So this idea of neurodiversity is very different than the medical model, because the medical model is pretty laser focused on the idea of things like autism and ADHD being problems that need to be solved. And this starts even just sort of with how we understand like a neurotype like autism. So, if you crack open the DSM, and you read about, well, what does it mean to be autistic? You just see a list of problems, right? Persistent difficulty in social interaction, restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities, present since early life. It's this pattern that sounds pretty bad. That's just all of these different challenges that come with autism. That's all the DSM talks about. But autism can mean so much more than that. Autism might mean unique perspectives. It might mean innovative thinking, like a unique sense of humor. It might mean deep joy from special interests. That there's things in my life that I really take pleasure in that I probably wouldn't care at all about if I wasn't autistic. And that is a part of the autistic experience that is not captured in the DSM. And I do want to be clear that, like people with autism are very different. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, as Dr. Stephen Shore has said. And so I don't mean to say that every autistic person is the same of these things, but in general, I think it's fair to say that autism brings both challenges, but also gifts and joy, just as any other form of diversity does. But the medical model kind of ignores all of that. It says, okay, well, if you're autistic, that's a problem. And the way that we solve that problem is we try to make you as normal as possible. And so oftentimes, if you go to therapy as an autistic person, especially the kinds of therapy that are available for kids, you are taught to suppress, harmless autistic behaviors. Like when I was a kid, I would run around in public and I would flap my arms as a form of stimming. And that was something that was like really fun, really joyful for me. And then over time I learned, I shouldn't do that. Like, that's not okay. And so I suppressed that, and I kind of lost that part of myself, the ability to do that in public. But like, it doesn't hurt anybody for me to do that. It doesn't cause any kind of problems. It's just different. But the medical model says different is not okay. We need to shut that down. The medical model also says, well, if an autistic person comes in for treatment, we should teach them to communicate like neurotypical people. We should teach them social skills. We should help them understand, how other people expect them to act and behave in that way. Granted, like, I think we could all use a little bit of help in learning how to socialize with other people. And I think that learning new skills is never a bad idea, but it's notable that the only answer is, oh, other people aren't accepting you. Well, that's your problem. You need to figure out how to communicate in a way that they can accept. And then we also teach autistic people to just endure uncomfortable environments. Like, oh, that restaurant is very loud. It's a sensory overwhelming thing for you. Well, it's not normal to have a meltdown in the middle of the restaurant. So you just have to deal with it. Every part of autism that is unique, the medical model says, well, let's just sort of bulldoze that over. Let's try to make you as normal as possible. But what if we found a different way? What if we said, well, what if instead of trying to teach, autistic people to suppress their behaviors, what if we could teach society to accept harmless, behaviors? Like if somebody is stimming and they're not harming you, they're not bothering you, just let them stim. Or what if we, teach people to communicate in a way that autistic people understand? Because autistic people's communication, it's not worse, it's just different. There was actually a recent study where they got neurotypical people, put them in groups, they got autistic people, put them in groups, and then they got mixed groups. And then they saw sort of how they communicated with each other. And what they found is that autistic groups were just as effective at communicating within themselves as neurotypical groups were. It's just that the mixed groups where the communication broke down. So autistic communication might look different than what you're used to, but it's perfectly valid, perfectly effective. And what if other people were willing to try to communicate in a more autistic way when they met an autistic person, instead of the onus always being on the autistic person to adapt to the neurotypical person? And then finally, instead of just teaching autistic people, it's weird that bothers you, you just need to endure it. What if we were very proactive to change environments in a way that worked better for autistic people, or provide accommodations that helped autistic people navigate challenging environments? And obviously, this can be applied to all sorts of different neurotypes. I'm just sort of using autism as the example because it's the one that I can speak the most directly to. But this would be a radical paradigm shift. And obviously, I'm not saying that if somebody comes into a therapist's office or a doctor's office and they have autism, that it should be like, well, I'm not going to help you in any way. We just have to change society. But I think instead of shifting from this idea of like, well, we need to take this person, try to make him normal, instead we can have a more customized approach. We can say, well, this autistic person, they need understanding, they need, acceptance, they need to be sort of seen for who they are, understood for who they are, accepted for who they are, and then they need customized supports based on whatever their unique needs are. And the fact is that really wouldn't be that different than how I think anybody ought to be treated when they walk into a doctor's office or a therapist's office, because everybody needs understanding, everybody needs acceptance, everybody needs customized supports and customized help. It's just that typically, our society automatically provides this to neurotypical people, whereas autistic people or people with ADHD or whatever, they really have to fight for these things. Speaking of customized supports, I'm going to support my need for water. So how can we do this? How can we like create environments that are neuro-inclusive? And this is a little bit like can be applied in different ways, right? Because, not everybody is, the leader of an organization and they can, make huge changes in the policies. But all of us have at least some ability to affect things within our sphere of influence, whether it's just as simple as how we treat another individual, to maybe having the ability to advocate on behalf of people to folks in authority. We all have the ability to create more neuro-inclusive environments. And what is an environment, though? Like when I talk about that, what do I mean? Well, an environment, like it incorporates different concepts. An environment is the physical and sensory surroundings that a person experiences life in. And so everything from the noises around them to the other things that they sense to the tools that allow them to move around or interact with the world, like those things are part of the physical and sensory surroundings. But the environment is also the social and cultural expectations. Like if I go to a cocktail party and I'm just supposed to know how to join a group and mingle and make conversation, that's part of the environment. And that would be a different environment than like a speed dating event where it's structured and where there's clear expectations for what I'm supposed to do. And then finally, workflows and processes are part of the environment. And what I mean by that is just sort of any process that somebody has to go through in order to complete a task. That is part of the environment. And it could be, like somebody's actual job, right? Like how is their actual job accomplished? But it could also be something like a task that they need to go through to access just any other need of theirs, right? Like if I go to the grocery store and I need to, pick a thing off the shelf and I need to take it to the cash register, like that's a workflow, that's a process. And that's something that may not be accessible to everybody, right? Like somebody with a physical disability might have a hard time reaching something, that's heavier on the top shelf. Somebody, who is neurodivergent might have a hard time navigating through a really crowded, shopping center or handling, loud music that's playing over the speakers, things like that. So these workflows and processes, these show up in all sorts of different aspects of life, not just our actual workplace. And so these are the things that we can try to change to create a more neuro-inclusive world. And again, we can try to change these for other people, but we can also change these for ourselves. If you happen to be neurodivergent, or even if you think you might be, there's ways that you can advocate and try to address that. And I'll talk more explicitly about that a little bit later on. But I just sort of want to acknowledge that like all of these things, how this is applied might be different based on your role in the, like in the organization or the group. But these will hopefully spark some thinkings about what the goals are or what you might be able to accomplish. So first of all, we want to talk about sensory needs, because sensory needs are often one of the both biggest and least noticed challenges for neurodivergent people. Because if you're a neurotypical person, you might have no idea that a particular smell is extremely uncomfortable for an autistic person, or you might have no idea that, like a TV being on, is extremely distracting for a person with ADHD and makes it, hard for them to focus, on the task at hand, something like that, because it doesn't affect you in that way. And so you just don't think of it. And so being attentive to sensory things can be one of the biggest low-hanging fruits in terms of making an environment work better for neurodivergent people. And so how can you do that? Well, first, make reasonable changes to the environment. Oftentimes, it doesn't take that much to make an environment, like the sensory environment, work for neurodivergent people, right? Like if a clock has a ticking noise that's very uncomfortable, see if you can turn the ticking off. If there's a fluorescent light that is buzzing and is uncomfortable, see if you can replace the bulb. small things like that can sometimes go a big way. Also, if you can, try to allow people to control their own sensory experience. If you have the ability to, try to, give, like, especially if you're setting up an environment that such as, therapy or something like that, where people are going to be, like, it's not a huge group of people, but it's a smaller group, maybe give people the chance to have autonomy over being able to change, like dim the lights a little bit, or ask for music to be turned off, or things like that. Also, if possible, especially in a workplace, see if you can provide things like noise canceling headphones that people can use, or if a work uniform is uncomfortable, it has a negative fabric in some way, see if people can be provided with an alternative to that. And then, if you are the neurodivergent person yourself, try to bring things with you that allow you to control your sensory experience. So, when I go to a loud party, I'll typically bring some earplugs with me that I can use if I need them. Also, sometimes it's very strong or negative sensory experiences that are particularly hard. And if you can, try to help people avoid or plan and prepare for those things. So if, for instance, that at your workplace, there's going to be cleaners coming on a particular day and they're going to spray a bunch of bleach everywhere that's going to smell really bad, maybe try to give people a heads up and allow them to work from home on that day. Or if you have, for instance, if you're a business, and oftentimes, you have crowded periods that are loud, noisy, etc. Maybe you might want to have 1 hour of the day where it's specifically set up as quiet hours, so that people know when the busy times is, and they also know, when to avoid those times. I also want to talk about communication needs, because this is another place where neurodivergent people can oftentimes get into trouble. Or oftentimes, have problems because the environment isn't set up well for them. And going back to this idea of, like, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I'm not saying that every neurodivergent person has the same communication needs, but these are some concepts that are often true. First of all, oftentimes neurodivergent people really benefit from direct and explicit communication, because if you rely on nuance, subtext, suggestion, things like that, it might get missed, it might get misinterpreted. And so being willing to just directly communicate something is really useful. Also, inviting clarification. If you share something, if you explain something, have the ability to be like, did that make sense? Do you understand that? Can you respond with what your understanding was of what I just said? And obviously you don't want to do it in a way that's like judgmental or infantilizing, or like, I don't think that you understood that, but more as a way of like, hey, help me communicate better with you. I don't know if I communicated that well. Can you tell me what that, how that was and what I need to clarify? Also, a lot of times using written communication can really help neurodivergent people. And so documenting expectations and instructions, like writing down, this is what I need from you, or this is what the rules are of, like this thing, or this is when this thing needs to be handed in, and making that very visible and explicit, that can really be helpful. And finally, especially in social settings, oftentimes there are unwritten rules and unwritten expectations. And so like writing those things down can really make it clear. Like if you invite somebody to a potluck, you probably know that, like, you probably expect, oh, like they're going to bring a dish because it says potluck, they should just know that. But like, if I've never been to a potluck before, maybe I don't know that. And so being able to, or maybe I don't know what to bring. And so I show up with an entire, like I spend $100 and I get the entire family dinner from somewhere, and I bring it because I just don't know what the rules are of a potluck. And so in an invitation or something, being able to write down like, hey, here's what you bring, here's how this works. Or, if there's some sort of social hour or something like that, being able to say, here's how, this process should occur. Even for something like, if you're running a therapy clinic or something, and somebody shows up, like, what do they do after they check in? Like being able to write down, here's what the expectations are, oftentimes creates a sense of comfort, because they don't have to try to figure it out on the fly. They don't have to risk that they're going to do it wrong. They don't have to try to interpret something that is more ambiguous. And so this sort of direct communication can be extremely helpful. And then again, going back to this idea of workflow and process needs, some of these things are more applicable specifically for the workplace. So one is the idea of adapting schedules to attention. And what I mean by that is, sometimes for, especially for people with ADHD, sometimes it might be easier to focus on one thing or another thing. And if you have very rigid expectations for when certain kinds of work need to get done, that can make it difficult. But if you have some flexibility around that and you say, okay, well, this needs to get done by this time, but it doesn't really matter what order it gets done in, it's sort of a situation where all of these things are valuable and you can kind of pick which one you work on based on where, the energy, the attention is for a given day, that can sometimes be really useful. Also, allow for stimulation or simplicity as needed. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes for people with ADHD, for instance, it can be very difficult to focus on something if there's no other stimulation going on in the environment. So sometimes having music playing, having a podcast going, that can help them actually focus in on the task at hand. Whereas, for somebody with autism, maybe those things are going to be uncomfortable or distracting. And so then they need simplicity, they need no noise whatsoever. And again, these are broad brushstrokes. I'm sure that there's people with ADHD that prefer simplicity and people with autism that prefer stimulation. But the point is to allow people to have control over their environment to a degree so that they can move up or down in terms of the stimulation to simplicity to complete a task. So in like the mental health space, for instance, if you need somebody to complete all of their paperwork in a busy, loud waiting room, maybe it might be better if they have like a quiet place they could go to do that instead. Or if your waiting room is very, very quiet and still, maybe, allow people to, use headphones or something like that to give themselves some music as they complete that. Also, I really recommend this idea that if you notice anybody struggling to complete a workflow, whether it's, again, somebody at your workplace that isn't performing, up to standards, or whether it's somebody who's trying to access, a service at your organization and they're dropping out before completing the form or something like that, instead of assuming, they must just be lazy, they don't want to do it, say, this is a sign that they need some kind of tool or some kind of structure that will help them accomplish this in a better way. And obviously what the tool or structure might be could be, it's going to depend on what the specific situation is. But I think that you want to sort of be creative and sort of say, well, could we try this? Could we try that? Or ideally try to work with the person who's having the struggle and sort of be like, hey, walk me through what you're doing. And then let me know when it starts to get hard for you. And then when that happens, then say, okay, well, could we maybe rewrite these instructions? Could we maybe give some kind of tool like a time management software or, a template or something of that nature that will assist this person in accomplishing this thing. And then finally, sometimes there's no substitute for just having a live person able to help you with whatever it is that you're trying to do. And oftentimes asking for help can feel very shameful for somebody who is neurodivergent, because it's a very common experience to look around and see that you are the only one struggling with something. And it's really hard to ask for help if you feel like you're the only one that needs that help. And so trying to really proactively make help available, trying to communicate very clearly, we want you to ask for help, and have somebody who is on hand to help somebody fill out a form, or help somebody navigate the checkout process, or help somebody complete a task at work, whatever the workflow or the process is, make that help available and make it a very shame-free kind of thing to access. I also want to talk about these are all things that are examples of how anybody can sort of create an environment that is more, accessible and inclusive for neurodivergent people. And obviously, if you're a neurodivergent person, you can apply some of these same ideas by, asking for some of these things, or trying to, like create your environment in a way that addresses them. But I also want to give some specific tools for neurodivergent people that can kind of help them navigate the world in a way that will be more inclusive for them. I think the first thing that I would really recommend is to find spaces to remove your mask. And we'll talk a little bit more about masking in the next few slides, but essentially masking is where you put the pressure on yourself to be normal, to behave in a way that other people expect of you. And so you suppress a lot of your natural innate traits. You hide when something is hard or challenging for you. And that's really, really exhausting. It's really lonely. There's a lot of research on the mental health damages of needing to mask. Unfortunately, we live in a world where it's not really safe to unmask all the time. If I were to go to a job interview and I were to stim during that job interview, I might not get that job. And that's just sort of the reality of the world. But there's a difference between needing to mask sometimes and having to mask all the time. And so if you can find places to remove your mask, if you can, find friends, social groups, support networks where you can really fully be yourself, that can go a really long way towards helping you take care of yourself. Also, I really encourage this idea of letting yourself take a different path up the mountain. And what I mean by that is that you might have the same goal as a neurotypical person, but the way that you accomplish the goal might be different for you than it would be for most people. And instead of being ashamed of that, instead of being embarrassed of that, just say, woohoo, I found a way that works for me. And my path up the mountain might look weird to other people, but so what? If it works, then that's good. And so give yourself the freedom to be creative and to trust yourself to do things in a way that works for you. And similarly, like be proactive to create an environment that works for you. If you find that something in your environment is uncomfortable for you in a sensory way, try to change it. If you find that you're always confused about the unwritten social rules of the group that you're in, try to ask and see if people will clarify that for you. Try to advocate to shape an environment in a way that works for you. And then finally, don't compare your area of challenge to somebody else's area of strength. Because again, I could give an entire other talk about like shame as it applies to neurodivergent people, but oftentimes there can be this deep shame that comes up of like, oh, I see all these other people and they seem to be doing so well and I'm struggling in this area. And I would say like, that's a trap. Instead of looking at your areas of challenge and compare them to other people's areas of strength, just look at your areas of strength, because I guarantee there's going to be some things that you bring to the world that are really wonderful. Maybe it's something that you do very well. Maybe it's the fact that you're really kind and you're really loving. Maybe it's the fact that you can just get a lot of joy out of something in life. All of those things are really good and really meaningful. And if you focus on that and build your identity out of that, that's going to be much more fulfilling for you than saying, oh, I can't focus as well as somebody else, or I can't make small talk as well as somebody else. So I wanted to expand a little bit more on the cost of masking, both for neurodivergent people to understand, why they should, why it'd be good if they can do this less, and for neurotypical people to understand why it's important to try to invite neurodivergent people to be safe enough to take off their masks. So again, masking is changing behavior to hide or suppress natural neurodivergent traits. The key thing about masking is that it changes behavior that doesn't hurt anybody. It's just different. So, if I, really don't like, wearing deodorant, well, if I don't wear deodorant, that's going to be very uncomfortable for other people. And so it wouldn't be masking to put on deodorant. It would just be, being considerate. But if I stim, that doesn't hurt anybody. That doesn't affect anybody. And so if I suppress that, then that is masking. And again, there's a lot of research on this. It's draining, it's stressful, it creates loneliness. It can sometimes even increase risks of suicide. So masking is a very big problem. Masking also is amplified when you have additional non-dominant or marginalized identities. So if, for instance, you're a Black autistic person and you have to mask and you also have to code switch to meet white culture, or you're a member of the LGBTQ community and you have to hide both your sexuality, and your ADHD, there's a cumulative exponential toll that happens. And so this can really do a lot of damage to somebody's mental health. And so finding spaces where you can take off that mask, where you can be around people who will accept you is really critical. The actress Julie Garden said, always be a first-rate version of yourself, not a second-rate version of somebody else. And that's kind of the core idea of masking. Like, let yourself be yourself. Don't feel this pressure to be normal, but instead find the communities that will accept you, even if you're weird. And again, I realize that the world that we live in, it's not safe to do this everywhere, but it's safe to do this sometimes with some people. And if you can find those people and take the mask off there, it's really going to bring a lot of benefit to you. But I also want to acknowledge that, saying, oh, well, don't mask, that doesn't mean that, like, oh, if you have, ADHD, it's okay to just show up 3 hours late to somebody's birthday party because you got distracted. And so I think that there's a pathway to being kind without masking. And I would define kindness, that is, it is changing behavior due to an awareness of how your actions will affect others. And it changes behavior that will affect people, even if they love you, even if they accept you, even if they understand why you did that thing, it still hurts them, it still upsets them. That's the sort of behavior that you want to change with kindness. And the thing with kindness is that that's not unique to, a neurodivergent person. Like, everybody has a responsibility to be kind to other people. And so I think that, neurodivergent people might have specific ways where they need to try to address their challenges in order to be kind to other people. But the goal is, kindness rather than masking. So some examples of this, if you have a behavior that you use to self-soothe, like stimming, if you just resist the desire to use that, that would be masking. But if you're somewhere where your stimming would be disruptive, like maybe it's like it's a meeting where everybody's discussing something, or you're in the front row of the theater or something like that, then maybe the kind thing to do would be to excuse yourself temporarily so you can do that. Another example of masking might be to pretend to prefer a normal hobby instead of a genuine one. So if I really like dinosaurs, but I tell everybody, oh yeah, I like football, that's masking. But kindness is asking questions about somebody else's hobby, even if it's not your particular interest, because everybody likes to be asked about the things that they like, right? Or arranging your desk or your space in a way that you think other people would do, that's masking. But collaborating to arrange a shared space, in a way that incorporates the needs of another person, that's just kindness. So let's also talk a little bit about mental health stuff, because I know that we have an audience of practitioners here, and I want to talk about how we can make mental health spaces more neuro-inclusive. So I first want to talk about the physical environment of a mental health clinic and how that can be made neuro-inclusive. I think some of the easy opportunities are to provide sensory objects and ask about sensory needs. So like a sensory object could be like a fidget toy. It could be like a blanket or a pillow that has like a nice fabric somebody could run their hand over. That allows somebody to be told that it's okay to sensory self-soothe or stim or things like that. And then also asking about sensory needs, asking like, would you like me to, dim the lights? Would you like me to turn off the white noise machine? Would you like me to, if maybe I have a scent that I use here, would you like me to not have that scent? Making sure that a person can set up their therapy environment in a way that works for them is really useful. And then also affirming neurodiversity in your marketing materials. Like if you're able to, as you are writing about the different conditions that you treat or the different issues that you work with, if you're able to affirm that, like, if somebody comes to you with autism or ADHD, you don't see that as this terrible, awful disease that must be cured, but you see it as a way of being that needs support and accommodation. That can help people feel like they're going to be safe in working with your clinic. Also, within the therapy session itself, it's really useful to set affirming goals. And by affirming goals, I mean, instead of trying to make somebody be normal or suppress natural parts of themselves, could you set therapy goals that are like, well, I want to make more friends. like it's not, I want to act more normally. It's I want to make more friends. And maybe that takes the form of finding people who will accept you, even though your social skills are still, very neurodivergent. Also considering reasonable policy flexibility. Like I think it is important to have, policies that you enforce and to treat people fairly. But sometimes certain forms of neurodivergence can make it very hard to, to show up to every session on time or to keep track of your own calendar, things like that. And so even if, for instance, it's not your policy to send people a reminder text, maybe if you have a client with ADHD, it would really go a long way if like 20 minutes before the session, you just send them a text and you're like, hey, I'll see you in 20 minutes, or an hour before, or something like that. It's also really important to make it safe to offer feedback. And obviously this is true of any kind of therapy that you do with somebody, but doubly so for somebody who is neurodivergent, because again, a lot of times there is this pressure to be normal. There's this pressure to not be the problem. And so if a neurodivergent person isn't getting their needs met in therapy, they might be afraid to bring that up to you because they don't want to be needy or a problem or something like that. And so if you instead make it, you model asking for feedback, you model, I really want it. If there's something not working, I really want you to tell me. That can go a long way in making it safe for them to say, well, actually, this isn't working for me. And then be sensitive to intersectionality. And so this again goes back to the idea that when you are part of multiple marginalized groups, the effects of those intersect with one another. And so be aware that somebody who is neurodivergent and who is also a member of a different marginalized identity, those things are going to intersect in complicated ways. And you want to be addressing that in how you do your therapy. I also want to talk about how we can support neurodiverse clinicians, because there are clinicians like myself who are autistic or have ADHD or any number of different things. And we want those people to be able to be successful in their therapy careers, both because, neurodivergent people, deserve to have successful careers, and also because representation is important. And I've sometimes had clients who it's really meant a lot to them that they can see a therapist who also has autism, like themselves. And so how can we support neurodivergent clinicians? Well, one thing is that you can provide time management supports, because certain forms of neurodivergence, keeping track of time can be really difficult. And so in session, these are just some examples, just to kind of get you thinking creatively. But in session, there's something called a time cube, which is sort of like a visual clock that kind of changes color as you get closer to the end of the hour. So somebody doesn't have to like look at a clock and process it. They can just sort of be like, oh, it's blue. Like, I need to wrap this up. There's also Pomodoro timers that can set a certain amount of time so that you can kind of complete notes within that time, potentially being able to send people reminders for deadlines and meetings so that somebody isn't dependent on just looking at their calendar to know, oh, I got to get to supervision, but instead be like, oh, like I'm getting a text that, my supervision meeting is in an hour or it's later today. I'll be sure to remember that. I also think it's useful in session to allow for non-obtrusive use of fidgets and sensory supports. So, if you have a therapist that wants to fiddle with a fidget cube or something of that nature, I think that should be allowed, even though that's not, normal. But again, who cares about normal? Obviously, you don't want to be disruptive to the client's experience. But my rule of thumb is that, in therapy, we're used to having a clipboard and taking notes, right? And if something is equally unobtrusive as a clipboard, then I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be allowed. Of course, you want to get informed consent from your clients. You want to say something like, hey, I use this little fidget toy. It helps me stay focused on talking to you. But if you prefer, I cannot use it during our sessions. What would you like to do? And if a client says, I don't want that, then okay, fine. But it shouldn't be a rule from the supervisors or from the clinical directors that this is not allowed. It should only be a case-by-case thing with clients. Finally, I think it's important to provide neurodiversity training to supervisors, because just like any other form of diversity, you don't know what you don't know. And if supervisors want to give ethical quality supervision to their supervisees, then they need to understand these concepts. Also, it's important to support clinicians outside of their therapy work and with their wider career development. And so providing structured social and networking opportunities where, again, some of those unwritten rules are written down, where somebody who might not naturally be as good at networking and socializing can still make connections. That can be really valuable. Using competency-based hiring rather than interview-based hiring. I mean, this is just true in general because interview-based hiring isn't that good, but somebody that might behave in a neurodivergent way in an interview, that doesn't mean that they can't be a great clinician. And so if your interview is just based on, oh, what kind of vibes did they get me? That can often cause you to hire people that are like yourself rather than people who are the best possible candidate. Also offering non-clinical coaching in addition to supervision. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes, if somebody is neurodivergent and maybe they're having trouble socializing with the other, practicum students, or they're having trouble with their time management, supervision time gets taken up to handle those professional development issues, which means that they have less supervision time for their clinical training. And so in order to have that be balanced, offering non-clinical professional development coaching outside of supervision can sometimes be really useful. And then finally, inviting and facilitating the seeking of accommodations. Again, there's a lot of shame. It's very risky to say, hey, I actually need help with this. And so modeling that, inviting that, making that safe goes a long way. And so finally, want to close with this idea. As you are handling neurodivergent, as you are navigating through questions of neurodiversity or interacting with neurodivergent people, the best thing to keep in mind is this idea of compassionate curiosity. And what I mean by that is, let's say you bring home a new dog and your dog chews up your socks. Is that a bad dog? Did you get a defective dog and you should, return it and get a new one? No, every dog is a good dog, but then you ask, well, why would a good dog do a bad thing? And the answer is that they have a need the environment doesn't allow them to meet any other way, or they don't understand that it's bad. So if your dog doesn't have any other toys, of course he's going to chew up your socks. Or if your socks are right next to his toys, then of course he's going to chew up the socks because he doesn't know the difference. So you need to either address the need or address the source of the confusion. And so, we can, apply this to people to say, assume that they're a decent person with good intentions. That's the compassion part. And then ask, why would a decent person do this bad thing? That's the curiosity part. And then you find the need or misunderstanding, and then you meet the need or resolve the misunderstanding. And so, just a quick example, your neurodivergent teammate wears headphones in the break room instead of talking to the team. Are they rude? Well, no, we would say they're not rude. We're going to be compassionate. We're going to assume they have a good reason for it. And so why might that be? Well, maybe they have a sensory overload. Maybe they're stressed from work. Maybe they're anxious. Or maybe they just misunderstand. Maybe they think that if you walk up to them, if you want to talk to them, you'll walk up to them and then they'll take off the headphones then. They don't realize that the headphones are sending the signal that they don't want to be talked to. So when in doubt, applying this technique of getting compassionate, getting curious, that can often help you find a way forward. And I have one other example of that, but we're going to skip through it for the sake of time. So assume good intentions unless proven otherwise. Identify and accommodate unmet needs, and then accept differences whenever possible. I think if I can leave you guys with one final image to close with, it's this idea that humanity is an orchestra, not an assembly line, right? The whole point of an orchestra is that you got all of these different instruments. Nobody would go see an orchestra that was made up of 80 tubas. That would be a terrible concert. And so what we want is for everybody to be able to play their own unique note in the best way that they can. And that's what neurodiversity is all about. Instead of making everybody sound like a tuba, we want everybody to be able to play the note that works best for them. I'm obviously not the first person to think of this stuff. There's a lot of other great resources out there. The Autism Self-Advocacy Network is a great place to start. Neurodiversity in the Workplace has some specific resources around the workplace. We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation by Eric Garcia is a solid book-length introduction to this topic. It was where I learned a lot of these things for the first time. And then just to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion, I have a book coming out next year on Audible called Neurodiversity and the Myth of Normal. It's co-authored. No release date is set for that yet, but check back in a year and it should be available. If you want to stay in touch with me, danielwonder.com, improveyoursocialskills.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, any of those places. If you reach out to me, the contact form goes straight to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And speaking of, let's take our 15 minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Winder, and thank you for everybody for attending. It is 3 o'clock, so if you have to jump off, we understand. If you are able to stay and would like to stay for the Q&A, we do have a few questions, and if you will put your question in the Q&A feature, there's a lot going on in chat, and I may not catch them, but if you'll put them in Q&A, we will catch them. So the first question, Dr. Windler, is how do we know if we're neurodivergent? So are there some indicators we could look for?
Yeah, so I think that it's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to answer, especially in the context of like, well, do I have this formal diagnosis of like, am I autistic? Do I have ADHD? Things like that. I think that those questions can really only be answered in conversation with a professional. So talking to a therapist, a doctor, etc. I wouldn't recommend, definitively self-diagnosing. However, I think that the cool thing about the idea of neurodiversity is that it recognizes that everything is kind of a spectrum, that it's not like you've got the weird people and the normal people, but that, everybody, is just diverse in different ways. And I think that if there is some aspects of of these ideas that feel like they ring home for, they ring true for you, like, oh man, like I really do struggle with explicit, with implicit communication, and the explicit stuff is really helpful for me, or sensory stuff really is difficult for me. I think, you don't have to adopt a label for yourself to be able to take care of yourself by addressing those needs and like asking for sensory accommodations or asking for people to communicate more explicitly with you. And so I would suggest, starting with the place of, I've identified a need for myself, let me try to meet those needs. And if as you go through that process, you find that a lot of those needs seem to fall into this bucket that is like a neurodivergent kind of bucket, then at that point, maybe talk with a professional and, see if it might make sense to do an assessment.
Great, thank you. This next question has several parts. So if I need to repeat them, just let me know. Accommodating and creating their own environment, such as finding quiet corners, but they get exhausted to do. And yes.
Yeah.
Haley, sorry.
Your audio's cutting out a little bit, but I'm able to read the question that you're seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, the question is, etc. Like essentially, how do you respond to an autistic person that can create their own environment, but then has exhaustion related to like doing, anything without planning, prevention, prep, etc. And I think that. So I think if I'm understanding this right, it's kind of this idea that like a person could take care of themselves, but then if they want to like go and do something, then it's very hard for them to kind of leave this environment that's set up for themselves. That's like accommodating. Would that sort of be a good summary that based on your reading?
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
I'm going to let Haley ask the next question so that everyone hears it aloud. And since I'm having difficulty with my mic here.
Yeah, that's fine. But let me answer this one real quick, which is I think what I really recommend in that kind of situation where it's going outside the comfort zone that is extremely challenging. Oftentimes what works the best for it is two things. Number one, it's taking the tiniest step possible. And so it's not like, okay, we'll go out and spend all day outside your comfort zone. It's like, can you go get leave your house and go get the mail and then come back, like 30 seconds worth of something, or can you, maybe you don't go to a meetup group, but can you look at it online? Like find the tiniest sort of step of movement and then practice trying to do that without as much preparation, planning, etc., because that can sort of build up a sense of like, oh, I can do those things, and then you can build from there. The other thing that I would add is that oftentimes when you try to get somebody to do something that makes them leave the comfort zone, it's something that they don't necessarily want to do. Like the comfort zone's working just fine for them. They've got an environment that works well. Why would they want to go buy new clothes or whatever? And so trying to find a way where they can be encouraged to do things that are more intrinsically enjoyable or meaningful for them, that can also get you to take those steps.
Thank you. Right. The next one is, in my experience, I've encountered a lot of self-loathing in autistic communities. Autistic people who've internalized the idea they're broken and that that every bad thing that happens to them is their own fault. How do you think we should go about interrogating and deconstructing that self-loathing?
Yeah. So I think that it's it's tough because in some ways that really is a thing that therapy is going to be the best suited to address. And I think like not just any therapy, but again, this sort of affirming kind of therapy, because if somebody goes to therapy and all they get is like problem solving tips for how to be more normal, that might just enhance the self-loathing. But I think a good therapist can really address this. I think outside of a professional context, I think that the best thing that can address the self-loathing is a loving relationship. And I don't necessarily mean like a romantic relationship, but just a relationship with somebody who accepts you and approves of you and cares about you. That can, that is a counterbalance to the self-loathing, because here you have this other person that's like, no, like you're not loathsome, like you're awesome. And so I think my big encouragement for anybody who feels like they're in that place is to try to develop one intimate, vulnerable friendship where like it's a close person, you can take off the mask with them, you can receive acceptance from them. Oftentimes that goes a really long way in starting to thaw out that self-loathing.
Thank you. The next one is, what is the best way for autistic people to work within environments that actively resist accommodating their needs?
Mm-hmm. So another two-part answer. I think one is trying to really lean into meeting your needs as much as possible, like once you get outside of that environment. So like if you've got to go to work at a place that sucks, like then saying, okay, well, as soon as I get off work, like I have a plan in place for how I'm going to take care of myself, how I'm going to be supported, etc. But that can only sort of go so far. And so sometimes, well, okay, I guess I'll add one other thing. The other thing that can really help navigating those sort of hostile environments is, again, the idea of one friend. If you can find one person who is sort of your ally in that environment, that can really make it easier to navigate it. But those things only go so far. And so I do think that on a certain level, if you're like, this environment is really just really hostile to me, I would say to the extent possible, think about transitioning to a different environment. And I realize that that's not always possible, especially in the short term, but over the longer term, if you can look at, maybe I can work in a different place, maybe I can, transfer to a different school, etc. I think that being able to find environments that work better for you, sometimes that is what you need to do.
Great. I think this next one might be a little on topic. This is from Chad. It says, how can high functioning and successful Asperger's individuals safely build love relationships? Is there anything other than dating sites? Anything that you suggest?
Yeah. So I think that the place that I typically recommend is dating sites these days are it's awful. Like I don't recommend that. I think what often works the best is going to some sort of social group where it's built around common interests or common values. And so if you have a hobby or something like that, like just Google for like the name of your hobby and then club plus your city, and see if, like in Austin, if you are into pottery, you search for, Austin Pottery Club, there's stuff that comes up. Austin Kite Flying Club, there's stuff that comes up. And so going there, I think it's good because number one, you're probably going to have some stuff in common with people because you like the same interest. And number two, there's not the same pressure that there is of like meeting somebody off a dating app of like, I need to connect with you immediately. Like you can go and you can just have fun and kind of naturally over time, you can get to know that person. In addition to hobbies, you can also do values. So if you care about a cause, see if there's a nonprofit, if there's a volunteer organization, that can be another place to go and meet those people. And then just over time, as you connect with folks, you're naturally going to find somebody who you might be able to have a love connection with.
Awesome. What would you recommend a neurodivergent student ask for with regards to accommodations at the collegiate level? What are some things that can help students be successful in the classroom and socially?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to depend based on the person, right? Like, for myself, when I was in school, one of the big accommodations I needed was the ability to type up all of my assignments because my handwriting is illegible to everybody except for me. And so I had to be able to like bring a laptop into class. But somebody else might not need that. And so I think that really it's going to be a hard thing to like do ahead of time. And so I think instead you want to instead have the modeling, the invitation, so that people can come to you with their specific needs. I would say that probably one of the things that is most likely to be necessary for a lot of people is kind of like structured social group, like social opportunities. Because again, that having even just one friend makes a huge difference in the whole experience. And so, but trying to make that friend can feel overwhelming. And so having groups where it's a little bit facilitated, it's people are put together a little bit in a better way. That I think if you got to pick one thing, I think I would invest in that.
Great. Okay. I think it's still relatively rare to find self-disclosed autistic mental health professionals. Do you have suggestions for how we can encourage or recruit autistic professionals?
Yeah, I think I would honestly go like early in the pipeline to sort of look at how our grad programs accept and recruit people. And to kind of ask the question of like, is that being done in an accessible way? Is that being done in a way where an autistic person could look at that and think, I can be successful here and I can be myself here? Or am I going to have to mask for 5 years or else I'm going to get pulled into meeting with a clinical director and say, hey, we don't, like there's still a lot of stigma around this stuff. And I think that yeah, for program directors to be able to sort of look at the different components of their program and say, are there things here that we are making unnecessarily hard or uninviting for autistic people? I think that is that's probably the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on the profession.
All right, I think this may be all we have time for this last question I'm about to read. So it says, what if you are a professional who suspects they are neurodivergent, but you already know all of the different assessment methods? Is it hard to know how one would authentically perform? Is there something you would recommend in terms of seeking a diagnosis for that particular person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are like assessment psychologists that are the most specialized in testing and assessment. And they, I think it'd be worth doing a consult with them because they potentially would know of some instrument that's less common that you wouldn't be familiar with that they could use on you. I also think that especially in like adulthood, getting a 100% definitive diagnosis is not necessary because it's not like you got to have like a piece of paper to go to a school and say, give me this accommodation or whatever. You just sort of want to be able to have a reasonable guess for yourself. And so I think that being able to have a conversation with, again, like an assessment professional who could talk through your experiences and then give you like a best guess would probably be sufficient for your purposes of either knowing, is this a way that would be helpful for me to understand myself, or is there a better way that would be better for me to think about and understand my experience?
Thank you so much. And thank you for staying to do some of this question and answer session with us. We didn't get to everything, but we have shared your contact information. I have shared mine as well. We will send out an email with the resources, with the slides, and we'll have a link to the presentation. Please fill out our evaluation so that we can better serve you in the future. And thank you so much for being here today, all of our participants and Dr. Wendler. Have a great afternoon.